Look at the time. It's time for unprecedented. We are in unprecedented times. And the United States Supreme Court is increasingly becoming the last firewall, as scary as that might sound, to protect our democracy, our constitutional republic, our rule of law. Are we going to be a country that's ruled by a dictator and a king currently named Trump, or are we not? Are the three co-equal branches of government going to operate the way the framers and the founders wanted it to, with the friction that's required to do a check and balance? Or are we going to live in a frictionless society where the executive branch holds all the cards and all the power, gets to freely fire whoever he wants, gets to put out of business and shutter agencies and departments and put federal workers out on the unemployment line just because he feels like it, hollowing out all of those departments and agencies that make the government accountable to the American people? Is that okay? And what's the Supreme Court going to do about it? And I'm looking at you, Amy Coney Barrett. We're going to talk more about this court evolving. Is it evolving? What we're watching is an existential fight, Dina, I believe, and I'm sure you do too. An existential fight is broken out for the very soul of not just the Supreme Court, but for our rule of law and our democracy. And the cases that we're going to talk about here today, the one where the Supreme Court has given a win to democracy, to the rule of law, and has ordered the Trump administration to reinstall and pay $2 billion worth of humanitarian aid for services and goods already provided. But at the same time, they made another nutty, crazy ruling against public health and against clean water. You know, what I think what we're watching is a dysfunctional group of Supreme Court justices that are so conflicted and so, in various cliques and camps that they come up with these warped decisions, some of which you and I can understand, and some of which we scratch our head and go, what? That aren't even internally consistent with their own, what we think is their own philosophy. We're going to cover it all on Unprecedented with who else? Dina Dahl. I wouldn't do the show with anybody else. There's Dina. So, Dina, why don't we, I've chatted up enough here. I've framed enough here. You want to jump into the couple of Supreme Court decisions that we have? Then we have an oral argument to talk about how that went. We can sort of, put it all, frame it all with that introduction. Why don't you take the, to of course take the lead about the ruling that we got against the Trump administration one day, and then another ruling for the Trump administration the next day.
So great news with the Supreme Court ruling against Trump. I mean, we've kind of been waiting with bated breath, right? Because so many of these justices are in Trump's corner. But as you said, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, we were always holding out hope, and Chief Justice Roberts as well, because he cares about the institution of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court came down on the side of the groups who sued, saying, all this money you are stopping basically from going to us that you already promised you would pay us for work we have already done. Trump came in, Musk came in and said, we're stopping this money. Of course, as we see, they did it with urgency, no review, no thoroughness, et cetera, et cetera. And so they sued. These groups sued. And it was, they went to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roberts, along with Amy Coney Barrett and the rest of the liberal justices, side with the groups and basically said, yes, you have to abide by the lower court's injunction, which was to allow the flow of the money, about $2 billion in aid, to go as promised. And so this was a win. We have seen, this is not the only time the Supreme Court has stopped Trump. We saw it also within the Dellinger case, where they kind of put a pause on his firing. Trump wanted them to have this emergency appeal overturning it, and they denied that. And so this case, the Chief Justice Roberts said, to the lower courts, make it clear. You have to make it clear how they need to abide by the order, but go ahead and do that. Lower court, make it very clear how they need to pay out these funds. And Justice Alito had, in his opinion, I'm actually going to quote it, because tell me if you think this sounds a lot like Musk on X, right? I mean, my gosh, it could have been word for word. He says, does a single district court judge who likely lacks jurisdiction have the unchecked power to compel the government of the United States to pay out and probably lose forever $2 billion taxpayer dollars? The answer to that question should be an emphatic no. Okay, so that was very similar language that we saw here. So here's the thing we've been talking about. Is it a constitutional crisis? Well, if you have a Supreme Court who literally thinks a judge can't do that either, and they're the ones who decide what the Constitution is, that's not a constitutional crisis. Thankfully, Justice Alito is in the minority. But him mimicking that language so closely is, oh my gosh, it's almost like he's become unshackled. I think that Trump MAGA right Supreme Court justices aren't even pretending anymore. Such a political statement on his part about the American taxpayer money. It was so political. But the problem is for those of us who have been, for those of the Midas community who have been following our show, we talked about this idea of a district court judge making a decision that affects the entire country. This is not new. This is called universal injunctions. It is how our law functions. It's how our law functions in some ways, because otherwise it'd be very confusing, right? If a California judge said a federal law worked a certain way, and a Massachusetts said it worked a certain way, and they both issued opposing injunctions, I mean, there is a way to try to resolve that dispute. We have a way in the law, but really it's confusing. And so we allow for universal injunctions because if the law is unconstitutional or illegal in California, it should be illegal everywhere because we're talking about a federal law, right? And not a state law. And the Supreme Court had a very recent chance to address this universal injunction, as we talked about in this show, in January when they had the anti-money laundering case, if you remember Popok. And it was Biden's administration who actually asked the Supreme Court to address the universal injunctions because they didn't like it there. And we were saying, hey, we want these universal injunctions. Don't stop them because we need them under Trump, right? And this is a perfect example. In this case, one district judge did protect U.S. aid around everywhere because of their one thing. So the Supreme Court in January declined to address the issue of the universal injunctions. And it was only Justice Gorsuch who actually came out in a concurring opinion there and said, I think we should take this up. We should decide universal injunctions once and for all. Justice Alito was silent in that case. He was not so outraged about one single district judge doing something with anti-money laundering. He didn't come and say it in his opinion and, be on his soapbox. He was silent. All of a sudden, he's outraged about this. Well, Justice Alito, it's the hypocrisy, their unwillingness to be consistent in their policies. If you really cared that much, you could have helped, at least talked about it in January, insisted on it. So it's, to me, like as a lawyer, we're looking at this. In some ways, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? I want to believe that we just have differences of opinion about interpreting the law. But when you are so inconsistent in that way and you're so outraged when it comes to a universal injunction with Trump and you mimic the same thing Musk says, but just a month and a half ago, you declined to even make a peep about it when it was a universal injunction not about Trump, that is why you lose the credibility, right, of the American people when you do those kind of acts.
Yeah, I mean, a court accountability action, which does a lot of great work here on Legal AF, Lisa Graves and Alex Aronson, Mike Saxonall, they are convinced, and they've convinced me that what we're watching with the right wing of the 4 votes of the Supreme Court, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Alito, and Thomas, especially Alito, are monarchists who believe in the Imperial President. See, it all fits their worldview. Alito's got a special thing for Joneses, for like imperial monarchs in Europe. He likes to go in his summer vacations and run around in velvet and ermine minks. I'm not making this up, with giant badges, and celebrate with other, I'm not attacking his religion, but other Catholic monarchists. This is like his thing. And it infects. The reason I care about it is not because I don't care what you do, what your hobby is.
Yeah. Right.
Right. You want to traipse around with like counts and countesses and that's fine. But if it infects your legal decision making and analysis and historical references, that's the problem with Alito. He's so upside down about what makes America great and the Constitution. He's so far outside the mainstream of constitutional scholars and most of his thinking, that's why you and I can't make heads or tails sometimes about the decision making, because we think we understand where they're coming from, but oh no, they'll just completely flip a different way, led by an Alito. When it comes to the presidential power, it's a scary group on the floor. The only thing that's holding the center at all, if the center is going to hold here, it's Roberts and it's Amy Coney Barrett. And we've said this last year, and the year before. Well, last year on Unprecedented, it's the rise of the Amy Coney. This is becoming the Amy Coney Barrett court. New York Times just did a piece on it just today. I still get the newspaper. People think that's so quaint that I actually have this thing called a paper in my hand. But here's the topic. Here's the headline. Barrett's voice may be crucial in Trump cases. A justice breaks ranks with conservatives. We saw it. We saw it last term, where she would chastise Alito and Thomas and tell them, your historical analysis for gun rights, for any kind of thing, looking back to old-timey times, to try to figure out whether there's an analog from our ancestors, our antecedents, is ridiculous. And what are you going to do when you talk about nuclear weapons? I mean, your whole thought process is upside down. And she took pains and was in the minority a couple of times, but was in the majority more than she was in the minority, joining with Ketanji Brown Jackson, Kagan, and Sotomayor. I think what we're watching is, I don't want to call it girl power, but we're definitely watching an affinity developing among the women, the only women on the court. And they have a lot more in common, personally, professionally, from a jurisprudential way, than Amy Coney Barrett has with Thomas and Alito.
Yeah, it seems like women do a good job standing up to Trump, and not necessarily that's what she's doing. I think she's just being an independent thinker. But
Nancy Pelosi is an example.
Nancy Pelosi, the governor of Maine, the Catholic
president of Mexico.
Yeah, the president of Mexico. He maybe has a little bit of a harder time, or they are more willing. But there is a bit of a pattern here, I have to say. Yeah, and she was also kind of concurred with the liberal. She did concur basically with the liberal justices in the Colorado insurrectionist case. She concurred with the immunity decision, even though she did agree with the majority. She kind of also carved her own path. So except for maybe the ones that go to her more core religious
the religious one, religion and babies, she's on the wrong side.
That one, she's not going to side with the liberals, but everything else, she's shown us again and again that she is willing. She's
going to rein in Trump, I believe. And the question is, can she get in this bandana in the middle of the tug of war? Can she get Roberts to join her, not the other way around, and get the 5-4 like we just saw in this U.S. AIDS decision, forcing, everyone was like, oh, here we go. And the other 4, as you said, Alito took great umbrage and clutching of pearls. Oh, shocked and stunned by the majority decision. Oh, heaven help us. And the way he framed it, like you said, like Musk, was such a straw man, had nothing to do with the case. Can a judge without jurisdiction? No, a judge without jurisdiction can't, but he does have jurisdiction. He was trying to take Judge Ali, who I like a lot. I think he'll be shortlisted for the Supreme Court one day. Who, by the way, is a Canadian American, and he's a Canadian lawyer too. And Biden put him on the court. He tried to take him out to the woodshed, but as I joked on another hot take, You need 5 to take somebody out to the woodshed. He only had 4. So the
Mm-hmm.
whole, the self-aggrandizement of power by this single federal
Yeah.
judge. I'm like, oh, will you give it a fuck? Will you give it a rest?
Right. Right.
Just because you don't like the decision and you knew you were going to be on the opposite side, so you wrote it's easy when you know you're going to lose. It's like the guy, the sports analogy is like, the player that in junk time can put up all the points. Alito knew he was on the losing end, so he had
Mm-hmm.
nothing to lose. In fact, he peters out. If you read the arc of that 8 pages, whatever it is, he starts out with "I'm stunned," and he
Yeah.
ends up with "I respectfully dissent." It's like
Right.
it just sort of peters out after his analysis.
Yeah.
But the problem that we're trying to point out to our audience, I believe, is that this court is so conflicted and fighting for its very soul, with the 4 versus the 3, with the 2 in the middle. And that
Mm-hmm.
struggle that
Mm-hmm.
we're watching, which is
Mm-hmm.
why we're getting warped decisions like the one, let's transition to poop, what we refer to as poop water.
Mm.
There goes the Clean Water Act, because according to this group led by Alito of all people, the EPA can't tell a company or a city or whatever on the discharge side of water pollutants, can't tell them at the front end in a permit process to prove they're not going to put raw sewage into your water. And the majority was like, that's unreasonable. You can test later. But in the beginning, that's what are you effing talking about? Or as one of the jokey websites that I like, or social media, SCOTUS Simplified wrote, in their view of Alito is a version of, and the EPA, you can eat shit. No, you can drink shit at least. That was their conclusion. What did you make of that? How is that consistent with any of their thought processes or jurisprudential frameworks?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe their thought processes can be best explained as anything that's pro-business, right? I mean, they don't like government. I mean, not all of them, but I do think it's really clear that the heritage of appointed justices were kind of put there to dismantle what they call the administrative state, which we call the government that protects us from businesses that are so greedy, they want to put raw sewage in our drinking water in order to earn more money. I mean, it's really disturbing that in this day and age in 2025, and we know how much we know about health consequences of things like this, that they want to roll back protections. It's just too bad. I feel like, when Trump ran the first time, he talked about how it would have been better for the country if Bush had just gone to the beach instead of going to the Iraq war. And I just keep thinking about that. Like, if Trump just did nothing, our country and our economy, our laws were on such a good path. Why are we rolling back something as important as keeping our water clean? But this is where those justices are. I think they don't want what they see as red tape, regulation. What the rest of us see is that tape is there to protect us. Sure, it might slow it down. Sure, it might be more expensive for the company, but it's there in order to prevent things like fraud and inefficiency and protect us, because it's sad, but it's true. Like, businesses are so greedy, they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart.
And this was even the city of San Francisco. This wasn't even business. This is like, we don't want to regulate at the beginning of the permit. I'm like, what?
Well, there you go.
Well,
That's
look,
even stranger.
the Supreme Court doesn't like the Environmental Protection Agency, which is weird because Gorsuch's mother, Ann Gorsuch, was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is how we got to the Chevron decision, which gave administrative agencies tremendous power, or at least the right of first refusal on interpretation of regulations, totally destroyed under the Loper-Bright decision last term by this Supreme Court. I thought that was enough. Now that Donald Trump is effectively removing all of the heads of all of the agencies and making a decision by executive order, that's the one I'm waiting on to go to the Supreme Court. Donald Trump declaring that every executive agency is no longer independent, it's under his greasy thumb, and he and Pam Bondi alone get to make all the legal interpretations of every regulation in every case or every matter. first of all, the bottleneck alone will immobilize the administrative agencies. You think Donald Trump's going to sit around and miss a golf game to sift through thousands of regulation interpretations? I mean, seriously,
Definitely not.
Not happening. But the Supreme Court still sees that the EPA is some sort of threat to society, and it's constantly clipping its wings now that it has the votes. And we're worse off for it. If anybody thinks that they're going to be better off, does anybody think in day 48 of the Trump presidential hostage crisis, that's what I call his administration, there were day 48 of American values being taken hostage? Does anybody think they're better off today than they were the day before the election? Write in comments if you think anybody in America, red state included, is better off today under the Trump policies and what he's focused on than they were before. Just look at your economy, your personal economy. Look at what matters around your kitchen table.
100%. No, we're so much worse off, and
right.
and a lot of and it's not all equal too. A lot of people who are depending on things like Medicaid and are going through really serious health issues, and they can't afford health otherwise, are so scared that their health is going to be cut off. I mean, that is like sick and depraved.
And who's getting screwed the most? The poor in rural areas who are also veterans. Who is that? Red state. That's all red state voters for Donald Trump. He's fired more veterans than any president in history. He's gotten rid of more veteran affairs benefits, including at VA hospitals, than any president in history. Does that sit okay with the red? I thought, we're for the blue, we're for the police. Well, he just pardoned everybody that beat the crap out of the police and almost killed them. That's why people were yelling out during the joint session speech when he said about that he supports law enforcement. They said, you lie. Jan 6th, you support that? You gave them all pardons. And the same thing with veterans. He stands there, about and attacks the Democrats about their military policies and their veterans policies. But look what he's done in just under 50 days. Putting aside the over 100 lawsuits that have been filed and the 50 preliminary injunctions. Yeah. So why don't we turn to this? There's three interesting cases that have all taken a slight turn here on their way to the United States Supreme Court. We got Beryl Howell, who just ruled yesterday, and it's like this 35-page decision. They're all 35-page decisions. In a 35-page decision, that Wilcox, the only Black person on the National Labor Relations Board, can be fired without cause, without due process, because he says so. Even though the Congress said the other thing, which is you can't do that. It has to be for cause. We want it to be bipartisan. We want it to be independent. That's the very nature. And so the three cases, the common denominator is these are the entities within the federal government, in the inner workings of the federal government, that protect federal workers one way or the other from being fired, retaliated against, partisan attacks. These, the Merit Service Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel, and the National Labor Relations Board, all put in place at different times. NLRB in 1935, coming off of the Depression, workers were getting abused physically, violently, and otherwise. National Labor Relations Board set up to protect them. 1978, the reform of the Civil Service Act by Jimmy Carter and Congress, bipartisan, sets up the Merit Protection Service Board and the Office of Special Counsel. Donald Trump has just taken a sledgehammer to all of them. Judges have uniformly, at the federal trial level, have all uniformly responded, applying the same case, by the way, Humphrey's executor from 1935, which we'll talk about. But we had one federal district court jump off sides 2 days ago and rule against Hampton Dellinger, the special counsel. And now you'll talk about what happens next there. And then we'll wait for the appellate decisions on the other two cases before we get to the Supremes. Kind of give your overview of where we're at, what happened with Hampton Dellinger, and then the road to the Supreme Court.
So when they ruled against Hampton Dellinger, he thought that his odds of winning at the Supreme Court were low, and he basically decided not to move forward with his litigation. And so the Supreme Court has dismissed anything as moot, right? Because his case is no longer a case. There's so many cases. I think they say there's 41 cases right, around Trump and all these executive orders and all these firings. And we're going to see this. We're going to see some of them go and some of them get added. So Hampton Dellinger is no longer going to pursue his litigation. But the Wilcox case, as you said, is interesting because this Supreme Court has decided since 1935, as you said, that, a president can't just go and fire somebody on these boards, right, that it's protected. But we talked about this in another episode. In 2020, Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion, which allowed Trump during his first term at the time to fire the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was an independent agency and would have been protected and not been allowed to be fired based on this 1935 law or ruling. But Chief Justice Roberts carved it out and said, well, because the agency is just one sole head and not a member of a board, I'm going to basically allow it. So now this is going to come before the Supreme Court. And the interesting thing will be, will Chief Justice Roberts kind of heed his own decision in 2020, where he clearly laid out a board member cannot be just fired without cause? Or was the 2020 decision how Chief Justice Roberts likes to operate? He doesn't mind overturning precedent, but he likes to do it in incremental ways because he thinks that what is more like you almost like set up the American people for further change instead of having like a abrupt change, right? He was against the Dobbs decision, not because it overturned Roe, but because they thought they should do it more slowly. So 2020 could have been his first chink. And then we will see basically the 1935 Supreme Court decision overturned by which with Trump would be devastating. It would give him a latitude to do everything he does and for all future presidents. Or does Chief Justice Roberts listen to his own opinion where he said, hey, if it's a member of board, a president can't do it. What do you think, Popok? What do you think he's going to do?
I think Chief Justice Roberts is going to find that, at least in the particular case we're talking about with Beryl Howell, that the national labor. I think Chief Justice Roberts is going to find that the National Labor Relations Board, created, as Beryl Howell mentioned, just 2 months after Humphrey's executor was issued by the Supreme Court, which said that Hoover, a president, could not remove one of the members of the Federal Trade Commission, which is very similar to the National Labor Relations Board, without cause, because Congress said so. And the historical precedent, the power of historical precedent, not only that in 95 years since NLRB was created, no president has ever tried to remove a member of the NLRB. You can remove the chairperson. You're allowed to do that. So he took the same person, the Black Democratic member, and he reduced her in rank from chairperson, but he can't remove her from the board for no cause without due process. And the understanding and any kind of legislative historical analysis that you would do is the Supreme Court at the time in 1935 knew about the earlier Supreme Court decision 60 days earlier, knowing that created the NLRB as the same kind of independent, bipartisan board that needed independence and needed protection from partisan attacks, and therefore put a proper limit on presidential power to remove. Beryl Howell also mentions, and I think Roberts will side with this. Amy Coney Barrett, I hope, will too. Also said, look, what we're going to see. This is why she spent 3 pages in her order talking about the unitary presidential theory, which is this theory that those that want an out of control rogue president often cite. It's Steve Calabrese is one of the famous right-wing law professors that kind of put it all together and talks about it a lot. And then there's groups led by Cass Sunstein on the other side. They're like, that's a myth. We've never had an imperial absolutist president of the United States. It's completely inconsistent with our constitutional checks and balance. And what the judge laid out at the beginning is this is the fight that we're now watching. And she sides with no dictator and no king. And for Roberts, he's going to have to look at the historical precedent here. No president's ever done it. Not only is there the Humphreys executor case from 1935, but it was reaffirmed by the Supreme Court a number of times, 1958, 2010, 2020. in the Celia Law case, all stands for the proposition that the Congress can put limited limits on the ability of the president to remove a federal officer. Beryl Howell also pointed out that, I had not that I hadn't forgotten, but I hadn't focused on. Nowhere in the Constitution, other than impeachment, is there a process to remove a federal officer. It's all left to case law. It's all left to historical precedent. It's all left to the Article 3 judges in the Supreme Court, Or as I like to remind people, for all those people that are originalists on the United States Supreme Court, what would the framers have said? There is the role of the Supreme Court in the three co-equal branches of government was established by an 1807 case, Marbury versus Madison. If it wasn't for Marbury versus Madison and Chief Justice Marshall, the greatest Supreme Court justice of all time, there wouldn't be a Supreme Court the way we know it right now. There'd be Congress and the president and this thing over here, with these guys in black robes and powdered wigs. What's that? Only because Chief Justice Roberts basically, talk about self-aggrandizement, took on the power, said, in order for this to work, we have to have power. And this is our power to interpret whether Congress has violated the Constitution, whether the president has violated the Constitution, and enforce that. So that was that fight with Andrew Jackson and all that crazy time. It's a Supreme Court decision, not the Constitution, that defines the power of the Supreme Court. And so, we look at the Supreme Court, we're textualists. The text. Where in the text? Nowhere.
And that's why I keep saying whether or not it's a constitutional crisis depends on what the Supreme Court says about this. Because like you said, they're the ones who've decided they are this powerful. If they willingly give up their power and say, oh, you're right, we got this wrong for 200 years, then there's not a constitutional crisis. I don't think Chief Justice Roberts is willing to do that on his watch. But if I'm going to make a guess, which predictions in law are always a bad idea, but I like to make them anyway, Chief Justice Roberts is going to let Trump win some and lose some. I don't think he's going to rule against Trump all the time. And I also think he's not going to let Trump win all the time. But I think he's going to, that's the kind of guy he is. He's all about he's such a, that's how I see it. So maybe in this case, I'm not sure, actually. I could see Chief Justice Roberts, to be quite honest, expanding it and letting Trump lose, because I don't like that decision by 2020. It might have been a precursor. But I think we can be comforted with the idea he's going to rein in Trump a lot more than the rest of the court, the Alitos, the Gorsuch. But he's not going to rein him in all the time.
No, I agree with you. I totally agree. And I mean, Trump is poking the bear.
Yeah.
Literally and figuratively. He fist bumped John Roberts during the State of the Union. Always appreciate you. Always appreciate. Like they're in the locker room, and a very uncomfortable looking Roberts on that.
I don't think he liked that. Yeah.
No. Well, later that day they issued the USA decision against Trump. He knew that was coming, and then Amy Coney Barrett gets a lot of flack. Amy Coney Barrett, she's got Haitian adopted children by MAGA because they didn't like the way she reacted at that speech. Because she's her body language says, I'm pulling away. That's the figurative. Poking the bear, that's the literal. The figurative poke in the bear is that in their briefing to Beryl Howell, which she cites in her order, which is going to go up to the Supreme Court, she says, and for their position that there is no ability to check the power of the presidency, they cite to the Trump versus U.S. immunity decision written by Chief Justice Roberts. Mm-hmm. But that said, criminal things you may not prosecute, not civil, legislative, congressional balance of power things.
Right. And even in that case, they didn't say every presidential conduct was immune.
Right. True.
They only said certain ones had immunity. So even then, as much as that we were disappointed by that, they were not giving him as blank of a check as maybe it felt like. So I don't think that Trump's going to get the kind of blank check he wants here. It's
going to be a lot of fun, and we'll turn over to the Mexico gun oral argument, and then to end. It's going to be a lot of fun when John Sauer, Donald Trump's prior criminal appellate lawyer, becomes the Solicitor General and starts arguing at oral argument. He hasn't yet. It's going to be fun for you and me because he is going to be so emboldened by having won a couple of appeals for Trump. This is the guy that is like packs 100 pounds of argument into a 10-pound sack. Nobody can follow it. And the question is, when he goes to the real extremes, watch Amy Coney Barrett, how she deals with Sauer, because I've seen her do it before. And now that he's the 10th justice, and he tries to abuse he's going to take some ridiculously extreme positions, which I'm counting on, which will only undermine the position of the administration before the Supreme Court and will only help people like Roberts side with Amy Coney Barrett and slide over to the 5-4 that we want. So I think that actually he's so outrageous. He's so out there that actually, if he was like a very conservative, beard stroking,
right,
eyeglass chewing, I'd be like, we're in trouble now. This guy's so out there. He's so mad as a hatter that's going to help us. We'll continue to follow that.
I totally agree. And before we go, and also I think that they all know Trump is looking over their shoulder. And so all of these officials everywhere are being even worse, right? Yeah. Let's say than maybe even they were inclined to be. So we've seen him take extreme positions. He knows Trump will fire him at any moment if he doesn't say the most outlandish thing in the Supreme Court. So like you said, that definitely
he's like the clown at a kid's birthday party. Like if Floppy the Clown's shoes don't explode at the right moment before the cake cutting, he's getting fired.
Yeah, for sure. He's like the next Marco Rubio. Trump is going to be
God.
Oh, sour this and that. And
Speaking of Marco Rubio, we'll go south of the border. Why don't you give a quick summary about what happened at the oral argument? We do oral arguments here as well. That the Mexican government had brought against gun manufacturers, been kicking around in federal courts for a long time, and it's up at the Supremes. And kind of what's your handicap of what's going to happen based on oral argument? And frame it first, tell our audience what the case is about.
Basically, Mexico was suing U.S. gun manufacturers for the harm, let's say, being caused in Mexico from these drugs getting to Mexico, getting in the hands of the cartels and creating all of this violence and crime in Mexico. And they were suing the gun manufacturers saying, you need to be liable for this harm. It was in front of the Supreme Court in oral arguments. And even the liberal justices seemed like they were not going to rule in Mexico's favor. This is the problem. We have a few laws that have come out that are problematic, let's say, for us as Democrats, right? The Citizens United, which allowed money being poured into it. The fact that the Supreme Court has never stepped in with gerrymandering and is allowing really horrible districts to be drawn in Republican areas. And the law in 2005, the Protecting Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which protected gun manufacturers from being sued for any criminal conduct. If they didn't have that law, it would be much easier for gun manufacturers to be sued saying, you need to put, let's say, protections on these guns. You have this deadly weapon. Our phones have Face ID, let's say, right, to protect us. You could foresee that these guns are going to be getting misused. You should have some sort of ID protection or something like that, right? We could be having litigation around that, let's say. But the 2005 law that Congress Act protects gun manufacturers from these lawsuits. And so it's pretty clear. And so the question in front of the Supreme Court was, one, whether or not the gun makers had aided and abetted violation of U.S. gun laws, and if so, whether the gun makers' conduct caused Mexico's injuries. Those were the two questions in front of the Supreme Court, because they cannot sue the gun manufacturers for the criminal activity because that's protected under 2005. They have to say that the gun manufacturers had aided and abetted violations of U.S. gun laws. And that was the problem that even the liberal justices felt like Mexico couldn't make that argument. They were kept saying, like, but what exactly are they violating under U.S. gun laws, right? And the question by Kavanaugh was, how foreseeable is this causation, right? If a pharmaceutical company sold a legal drug, but then it went on and into the wrong hands and got resold and, let's say, caused an overdose, like, would they be liable? Like, how are you able to kind of tie the two. So that is going to fail. That I think we can say that Mexico is not going to be able to sue the gun manufacturers for this. But for those of us who care about gun safety, that could be another issue that we talk to our representatives about, or our senators about, changing this 2005 gun law in a way to maybe hold gun manufacturers to account. It is probably true that they're never going to be maybe held completely liable for things that they cannot foresee, but that is always an argument for any litigation, right, Popok? So like, let's say I sue you, right, for something that happened. I always have to prove causation, foreseeability. Otherwise, I get thrown out in court. You're not protected by Congress's law that I can't even try to make that argument against you. So here, Congress has kind of stepped in and put a big foot down protecting gun manufacturers, because causation and foreseeability may be impossible, let's say, to prove in gun manufacturers, or maybe you sometimes could. So that's another law that, people who care about gun safety, if you're wondering, like, how do we change things? That's a law to look at, maybe repeal or revise it in a way to allow gun manufacturers to get sued. They can defend themselves just like anyone else, and maybe cases go thrown out, and maybe there's changes to make guns safer in this country.
Agreed. I mean, listen, I was involved with a case where it took an act of Congress to kill my case. It's all about lobbyists. For those that, when you hear that a state has a certain statute of limitations limiting your ability to sue, it's because there was a very effective lobby of doctors that shortened the medical malpractice statute of limitations. When or whenever you see a statute of limitations that's short to bar you from suing, that's because there was a lobby group behind it. Here, the gun manufacturing, the gun lobby, the NRA, and the Supreme Court justices that frankly were in the back pocket of the NRA, that were handpicked by the NRA, that were funded their campaigns, because there were campaigns to get them confirmed, funded by at the time the NRA. I had a case. It was a weird group of lawyers involved in this case. It was me. It was Harmeet Dillon, who's a MAGA Republican, who's the civil rights division head for Trump. But at that time, she was on the right side of this particular issue. Mark Aragos's firm. We all got together and we represented basically small businesses, a lot of CPAs, a lot of bookkeepers that were putting together these PPP loans during COVID. They were putting together the loan applications. And the way the statute was defined, agents were getting a piece of the fee that banks for funding the loans were getting from the government. So if the bank got 3 percentage points as a fee, a commission, they needed to pay one of those points to the agent that brought them the application. We had a very, very good case. We had dozens of them we represented hundreds of these small mom and pop CPAs and bookkeepers and everything. And we got to a multi-district panel to argue it. And while we were arguing it, the banks joined together and lobbied Congress, and they literally passed an act of Congress that by name eliminated our lawsuit. We were like, what? That was right. If you had left me into the courts, we would have won those cases, and tens of millions of dollars would have been awarded to people that deserved it, that worked around the clock apparently for nothing. But that's just the power of the lobby groups, and that's why we see things like this. But I think that's good reporting about what you observed. We like to manage expectations. So we've reached the end of another unprecedented here on Legal AF. We're doing it weekly. We're talking about what happens inside the court, things that are on their way in the runway to get to the court, ethics, violations and issues, oral arguments, the rulings, and of course, how the Supreme Court is going to act and operate during this Trump administration. Probably one of the most important times in our history to see how the Supreme Court, are they going to shrink, or are they going to stand up to the moment? And it's really going to be Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. Last word for you, of course, Dina Dahl. What do you want to tell our audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is timely that we did this show right before the election. We're hoping that Harris was going to win, but the Supreme Court is the ultimate backstop right now. It's the only, even though there are so many MAGA rights on it, they don't control the Supreme Court in a way that they right now control Congress and the presidency. It is the backstop. I think there's some willingness there by Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. And there is so much noise coming out of the Trump right now, so much distraction, so much noise. So I'm so grateful that we have a dedicated space to talk about this, because this is sometimes the Supreme Court is slow. We've seen them act quickly, though, in these last few weeks as well. But it is where we are going to know how the future is shaped.
Yep. Couldn't put it better myself. See you all next week on Unprecedented. Follow Dina Dahl and all things Midas Touch and her legal commentary. Me, Michael Popok, of course, here on the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us get and turn that odometer to 500,000 this weekend. With your help, we will get there. We're building this network and this channel with our bare hands. Till our next show. I'm Michael Popok with Dina Sayegh Dahl. In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories, the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.